Okay, I'm going to go over some of the discussions that you should have had for 1.10. First thing to notice in the directions that it says that these are all geometric sequences. Because they're geometric sequences, we know that we're looking for a common ratio, which means I'm going to be multiplying by a whole number or by a fraction. If the sequence is getting bigger, we're multiplying by a whole number. If the sequence is getting smaller, we're multiplying by a fraction. So if we look at the first table, a lot of you probably, to find the missing term, did a little guess and check. How can I get from 3 to 12, multiplying and making two jumps? So you might have thought that in terms of the explicit formulas that we've been making, that any y value, f of n, is equal to whatever the start is times the common ratio, in this case, to the n minus 1 power. It would be in this scenario because we started with x is equal to 1. So let's go ahead and fill in what we know. I know that f of n is equal to 12. That's my y value I have at the end. That's going to be equal to 3 times, I don't know what the common ratio is, to the n is 3, minus 1. So I get 12 is equal to 3r squared, right? So you're thinking to yourself, what squared times 3 gives me 12, is how you could think about that. I would suggest dividing both sides by 3, working on getting r by itself, and finding that 4 is equal to r squared. So now you're thinking to yourself, what number squared gives me 4? And a lot of you would probably think that that is equal to 2. So our common ratio is 2. On your calculator, remember that the inverse of squaring a number is to take the square root. So if I want to do the inverse of this squared, I would take the square root of both sides. So I hit second, the x squared button right here, of 4 is equal to 2. So 3 times 2 is 6. 6 times 2 is 12. Some of you might have noticed that there's actually another possible common ratio for this. When we take the square root of 4, there are actually two numbers squared that give us 4. One is positive 2, the other is negative 2. Negative 2 times negative 2 is positive 4. So your other common ratio could also be negative 2. 3 times negative 2 is negative 6. Negative 6 times negative 2 is positive 12. So either of those answers work. Let's look at the next one. Just like I'm writing an explicit equation, I start with some y value, f of n. I know that it's going to be equal to the start, which in this case is 7, times some common ratio, I don't know what the common ratio is yet, to the n minus 1 power, because I started at n is equal to 1. Let's go ahead and fill in what we know. We know that f of n, our y value, is 875, is equal to 7 times, I don't know the common ratio yet, n is 4 minus 1. So that is 875 equals 7 times r to the third power. I would suggest dividing both sides by 7 so that you get, let's see, 875 divided by 7, 125 equals r to the third power. So now, unlike last time, we're thinking what number times itself 3 times gives me 125. Well, just like taking the square root is the inverse of squaring something, taking the cube root of both sides would give us cube root of 125 is equal to r. Would get rid of that cubed. Or you can just think in your head what number times itself 3 times gives me 125. On your calculator, to do cube root, hit the math button right here. And if you scroll down to number 4, that's cube root. 125, and I get 5 is r. Now, in the last one, I had two possible answers, 2 and negative 2. Is it possible to have negative 5? The answer is no, because -5 times -5 times -5, that gives me positive 25. That gives me negative 125. And this was positive. So the only answer for this one is positive 5. So you get 35 and 175 here. All right, let's do one more. So any y value we know is equal to, the start in this case is 6, times the common ratio to the n minus 1 power. Let's fill in what we know. We know our y value is 96. I don't know my common ratio. N is 5. So we have 5 minus 1 power. So 96 is equal to 6 times r to the 4th power this time. I would go ahead and divide both sides by 6. So 96 divided by 6 is 16. Equals r to the 4th power. So you're thinking, what number times itself times itself times itself gives me 16? So you may be able to think of that in your head. If you can't, just like up here, the inverse of squaring something is the square root. Just like right here, the inverse of cubing something is the cube root. The inverse of quadrupling something to the 4th power, is to take the 4th root. So you put a little 4 there instead of a 3. On your calculator, you can do that by hitting the math button and then scrolling down right here where it has x. And then for x, I'm going to put 4th root of 16. And the answer in this case is 2. Could it also be negative 2? The answer is yes, because negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2, this gives me positive 4, this gives me negative 8, and this gives me positive 16, which is my positive 16. So you should notice a pattern. If the roots are even, it can be positive or negative. If the roots are odd, positive is your only solution. So then 6 times 2 is 12, 12 times 2 is 24, 24 times 2 is 48, 48 times 2 is 96.